Hey everybody! Oh, that doesn't feel right. What's up? Oh, that doesn't seem right either. How the hell do I start this thing? Hey everybody, and welcome to the first installment of Midnight Manager. This is where I try to sit down after the family's gone to sleep and try to explain some concepts about management for you and to share some of the experience and knowledge that I've acquired over the last couple of years to help others that are on the same journey as I am, trying to become better managers, better leaders. And what better time to do it than when I should be in bed. Let's go. Somebody on your team comes to you and says that they want to take a course in Photoshop. However, the course is pretty expensive. It's a few $1,000s and it's going to deplete your training budget for the year. However, you want to be a good manager, and this person, you think they're on a good trajectory. So you say, okay, well, sure, we'll approve it. A week later, one of the superstars on your team comes to you and says that they want to take a course in InDesign. However, you've already depleted your training budget for the year, and so you're forced to say no, despite the fact that maybe the second person was the one you should have invested in. If you find yourself in situations like this, there's a decision-making tool that I have found incredibly helpful and probably one of the most powerful ways to think about decision making and to unlock really good disciplined decision making. And I call it the principle. So what the principle is, it's basically the idea that you need to have an underlying reason or an underlying thesis that is driving your decision making. And the more logical that decision-making thesis, that underlying driver is, the more transparent it is, the better decisions you will make, the more predictable to your team you will be. To understand why the principle matters, it's important to reflect on why decision-making matters. So I believe that decision-making is probably one of the 2 or 3 things that matter the most in a managerial role. Like if you strip everything else down to its bare essentials, what you're basically doing is you're taking decisions and you're executing on the effects of those decisions. So the better you can get at decision making, the better you can get at being a good manager. And part of being a good decision maker, I think, is observing other people that are great decision makers and understanding what makes their decisions tick. And one thing that I think is in common for all good decision makers really is that they have a clarity in how they make their decisions, how they arrive at why they're going to do a specific thing, that is often driven not from some type of just ad hoc idea like this seems like a good idea or whatnot, but is driven by a deeper principle. There's something underlying how they connect that specific decision they're making to previous decisions they made or to what the organization otherwise have seen them done. And so this is really the principle in action. So it's the principle that any decision needs to be driven by a principle. In the original example of the coursework that I gave, what you could have done instead of immediately approving the training, consider what you could have done to make sure that not the first person that asked, but the best person that was deserving for the training based on what the organization needs and what your values are going to get that training. The way that you make sure that happens is by having a plan in mind for how to deal with trainings overall and to make it super practical and concrete. Consider having one principle that says everybody in this organization is going to be able to go to training once a year or once every 2 years or once every 3 years, depending on what your budget allows you to do, what the values of the organization says about formal training as a way of learning and growing your skills. So consider having that principle. Consider having the second principle that Anybody who didn't attend last year gets to go this year, or some other way that makes it fair. Or maybe it's based on anybody who's a top performer, anybody who's recently switched skill set. You might also have a principle that says that your training need to be attached in some way to your development plan. So you can't go off and just study Photoshop if you're a Python developer and you don't need it in your day-to-day because you mostly do backend stuff. So consider all of these things when you try to put together the underlying set of decisions. Now, this becomes really powerful when you write it down and you say to your team, when the person comes to you and they say, hey, can I go to this training or whatnot? And you say, hey, you can check out this document that I've written. And this is how we treat training here. So do you think that you follow these criteria? Is this clear to you? And if they do, maybe the person gets to go to the training if they match up to all of the criteria. And if not, what's interesting is the person then isn't going to be quabbling with, well, I want to go to the training or whatnot. Instead, they have a set of criteria, and they can argue with those criteria or not. But you can move the decision away from the concrete thing in front of you, and you can point back to this set of like pretty fair rules that you've established to make sure that everybody gets a fair share in their training. So having a tool like this is all well and good if you have the policy thought out in advance. But what do you do in case where this person comes to you and they say, hey, I want this training, but you don't have this principle developed beforehand? My advice to you is to, rather than to fall into wanting to be helpful to this person and try to make the decision quickly, to ask for some time and to say, hey, can I come back to you with a decision about this in tomorrow or next week, or like when's the deadline where you need to file for this conference, because I need to go and think about why would I not approve this, or are there rationale or reasoning that we should have behind a decision like this. I think in general a lot of managers try to be way too helpful in the moment to folks on their team, which might actually in the long run turn out to be much less helpful than asking for some time, taking a step back and trying to get to the principles that would be driving this decision. So is this only applicable for things like training budgets or other relatively simple decisions? No, I think you can see that this can undergird quite a lot of things. If you start looking for this principle in action, you'll see it basically everywhere in your organization where decision making is running smoothly and working out. You'll see some type of underlying reasoning if you just look closer, and that reasoning is going to make sense not only for the actual decision at hand, but for any decision that could follow from that specific set of principles. As an example, if you look at a pretty common facet of at least my corporate life is reorganizations. So every X months, be it every 9 months, every 18 months, if you're unlucky, much more often than that, your organization will reorganize. Maybe there's a shift at the management team level, maybe there's a different way to organize based on some objective that is pivoted for the organization. And oftentimes, when you look at the outcome of a reorganization and you look at what the CEO or the VP or whomever announces, it can either make sense or it doesn't make sense. And often it makes sense if there's an underlying organizing thought behind this reorg. It's not person X got department Y, or person Z got this thing or that thing, or this remit is going there. Instead is, we found this principle that we're going to organize around, say, capability or customer set. Like we're going to start going after maybe the enterprise and maybe small and medium-sized companies, maybe consumers, and we'll organize based on sales channel. And if you have an underlying decision like that, number one, the organization, it's going to make a whole lot more sense for folks on the team to try to look at it. Number two, this is where the real power for the working manager actually comes in. It's going to make it much less contentious to have difficult conversations around things like who gets what department, or is somebody not going to have their favorite role or maybe not a role at all at the end of this change. Because You can change the who gets what job conversation into two distinct conversations. You can have one that is the conversation about the principles. This is where you arrive at what are the things that are going to drive the decision that we're trying to get to. And then in step two, you can follow the implications of those principles into the organization that you're going to have. So if you decide you're going to organize on customer type, then it doesn't make sense that you all of a sudden would have a back-end team. And so maybe if there's a back-end lead that is very resistant to the notion that you would reorganize yourself around customer type, doing something like this might unlock the process, and trying to guide yourself by the principle might unlock the decision that you have ahead of yourself. So that was really what I wanted to share today. Whenever you find yourself making an ad hoc decision and not understanding why it doesn't pan out the way that you wanted it to pan out, think about if you can transform the ad hoc decision to a specific instance of a much more general principle. And if you can align on what that principle is, then you can take the decision in a much more clear, concise, and fast way, and the organization will understand you better for it. That's everything for me. Thank you.